Hello everyone. Today we are going to be doing a video. You can't see this at all. Anyways, right there at the bottom, Harry Truman's signature. And this is all things celebration for my trip that I made. I just did Dwight Eisenhower's. Before that I did my 400th video special, Jesse James, which will come out Wednesday. Truman, it's Monday, so it might come out. Eisenhower, I think, will come out tomorrow, which will be Tuesday. Jesse James will come out Wednesday. This will probably come out Thursday. But this is my 3 celebration videos. This is a long one, but I'm going to go ahead and do it in one just to get it done. Let's go.
Online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. In 1922, Harry Truman sat in his mother-in-law's house in a small town in Missouri, contemplating the failure that had been his life. He was nearly 40, and behind him lay a string of failed businesses and unfulfilling odd jobs. He was close to bankrupt, deeply in debt, and looked down upon by his wife's elitist family. Aside from a brief stint in the army, he had never lived outside his one-horse town. He was, in short, a bit of a loser. A man who had failed at life so thoroughly that even John Arbuckle would appear as an overachieving Hercules next to him. And yet, Truman's luck was about to change. In a quarter century, he would go from small-town nobody to leader of the free world. Another quarter of a century after that, and he'd be recognized as one of the greatest presidents in American history. So, how did this happen? How did a man so singularly unambitious wind up achieving so many remarkable things? Well, in today's Biographics, we're charting the strange and unexpected rise of Harry S. Truman, the nobody who became a somebody.
Really?
TikTok made me do it. If you use TikTok, you might have seen videos like these recently claiming that the combination of L-tyrosine and B vitamins
You know that old saying, some are born to greatness while others have greatness thrust upon them? Well, Harry Truman definitely falls into the latter category. Born on May the 8th, 1884, Truman was a poor country boy through and through. His parents were a farming stock, scraping a living on the edge of the American frontier. When Truman was aged just 6, his family moved to Independence, Missouri, a small town on the banks of the river that acted as a gateway to the American West. It was in Independence that the railroads terminated, that the wagon trains set off. Even in 1890, people still had living memories of the settlers who had come through here seeking gold and freedom. They also had living memories of an altogether more controversial time. When independence was settled, it was mostly by families from the South. The town was racially segregated, and veterans who'd fought for the Confederacy were still kicking around. Like many growing up at that time, Truman absorbed the prejudices that these men carried. For the rest of his life, he'd freely used racial slurs in private. But if his fellow Missourians thought Truman was just another good old boy, they'd be in for a shock when he finally reached high office. As he grew up, Truman went through all the usual pain we experience. He was often shy around girls and sometimes found it hard to befriend other boys. But Truman's childhood came with an additional dose of misery. Age 10, he contracted diphtheria and spent the best part of a year with his arms, legs, and throat paralyzed. By the time he recovered, the frail, nearsighted boy had lost whatever interest he'd held in the outside world. The rest of Truman's early years passed in a steady flow of disappointments. He tried to become a concert pianist, but he lacked the drive. He applied to West Point to join the military, but his poor eyesight excluded him. He enrolled in a Kansas City business college after high school, but family problems forced him to drop out after just a single term. Back in Independence, his father's farm was refusing to turn a profit, so Truman dutifully gave up on his dreams and went back to Missouri to help his...
That is not, so that's the home that he lived in, which was his wife's family's home. He lived, his aunt lived in the house across the street. Not the Horton. The Norad? I don't remember now. But they lived in a house that was across the street, as catty corner. And when you come into the property, you don't go in this front door. That's where you exit. You walk around here and around the back, and you come up through the steps to the back porch, which is where they always sat. Funny little side note, and you're not going to be able to see it here, and I didn't take a picture of it because I just now thought of it as something that was entertaining. Where the house is, across the street there are several homes. Like that takes up almost like that whole little block area. It's not, but it's got a big fenced yard and stuff. There is a brick house that would be catty corner, that would be on the corner, about not directly across the street, but like across the street and then 3 houses down, something like that, on a corner. It's a brick building. It's privately owned now. But when he would come home from the presidency, and he was still the president, the Secret Service bought that brick house, and there was a window there, and they would open up the window and they would just keep an eye on the house. And when he was gone, the city council came in and they painted the whole house white and made it the Vacation White House. And there's a flagpole which is out of sight. It's over here. And they would put the flag up. And they would hoist the flag up every time he was showing up. So that basically was just an alert for everyone in town to know, oh, the president's coming here. And then when he moved back home to this house, there was no Secret Service or anything like that. So they had these wrought iron fences put in to kind of help secure everything. And yeah, it's pretty interesting. That's just a little side note.
Par out. He'd stay on that farm for the next 8 years. Perhaps the one gleam of light in these trying times was Truman's relationship with his high school sweetheart, Bess Wallace. But even that turned sour. Wallace's family, they disapproved of Truman's background. When he proposed, she rejected him. Come 1917, Truman was a guy so used to getting beat down by life that it's a wonder he got out of bed in the morning. So, what saved him? What wild event plucked Harry Truman out of obscurity and set him on the path to greatness? For that, you can thank the wildest event of them all. On January the 19th, 1917, German High Command sent a message to Mexico. Known as the Zimmermann Telegram, it asked Mexico to join World War I by attacking the USA.
I did this. I didn't know how to do, I didn't want to do W1, so I was just doing this, and I was going to say World War I. But then I didn't know where he was going, and I didn't want to say it because I thought I'd be wrong and look stupid. But, kind of, I'm there.
Not being idiots, the Mexicans replied, no, and alerted Washington to Berlin's absurd plan. It was the beginning of the United States' slow entry to World War I, a war that would ultimately kill over 115,000 Americans. It was also Harry Truman's ticket to finally escaping small-town Missouri. In late 1917, Truman's National Guard unit was called up for basic training. Just before he left, Truman got a hastily scrawled message from a heartbroken Bess Wallace saying she wanted to marry him after all. Truman's response was as plain as his appearance. I don't think it would be right for me to ask you to tie yourself to a prospective cripple or a sentiment. And with that, his unit left Missouri. Military life suited Truman. He was promoted to captain and took great pride in running the best canteen in his regiment. But if you're expecting to hear that Truman just stayed behind the lines and didn't see action, well, prepare to be impressed. The unit shipped out in March 1918. That August, Truman was thrown headlong into the meat grinder that was the Western Front. Through September and into October, he fought in the bloody Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the only future president to see action in the Great War. When he emerged on the other side, miraculously unscathed, Truman had gained his first experience at leading men. He also gained a friendship with a soldier named Pendergast. Little did Truman know it, but his connection to Pendergast was going to change his life. Truman finally made it back to Missouri in May 1919. 1 month later, he took Bess Wallace up on her offer, and the two of them got married. Not long after, Truman opened a men's clothing store in Kansas City. It should have been the end of his adventures, a little project to occupy his post-war years. But there was no such luck. In January 1920, the sharpest, deepest depression in living memory walloped America. Wholesale prices plummeted 37%, while the US was gripped by the worst single-year deflation on record. Business failures skyrocketed. One of those failed businesses was Truman's clothing store. In 1922, deeply in debt, Truman closed the store for good. Then he and Bess moved in with her parents, who never missed an opportunity to remind Truman of his failings. This is the moment.
Have you ever wondered, you hear stories about, 6 minutes in, I've already been talking for, it feels like a half hour. You look at something like this, failed business here, failed business there, da-da-da-da-da. Have you ever looked at it and thought, this is the story, this is the setup. Yeah, failed here, failed here, failed here, succeeded here. Those other failures, they were going to happen. This is where that person was destined to be. Those other things, they were never going to work. You know, in hindsight, never going to work. You just weren't capable of that. It's just not, that wasn't in you. Even if you had the right people around. Some people fail. But then that one thing that they should be doing, it's like they just realize, oh yeah, this is what I love. And they just do it. And I always feel like all the failures that he had, they weren't failures because what he was destined to do, he didn't realize yet. That's my take.
We opened with the moments when Harry Truman, aged nearly 40, took stock of his life and realized it had accounted to nothing. However, fate was about to come knocking. Over in Kansas City, Tom Pendergast was looking for fresh meat for his political machine. The uncle of Truman's wartime buddy, Pendergast was also the city's Democratic boss, a guy who'd corrupted the entire state with his ruthless machinations. Yeah. But while he was corrupt, Pendergast also liked to use men who were personally honest to give himself some cover. Men like his nephew's World War I buddy, Harry Truman. That same year, Tom Pendergast contacted Truman and made him an offer. We don't know the exact terms, but we do know that Truman was suddenly installed as the local judge of eastern Jackson County. From there, the future president set about awarding fat contracts to Pendergast's allies. But while Truman's time with Pendergast was certainly dodgy, it wasn't completely corrupt. Although he played the game and did as his boss asked, Truman also took his new job seriously. On Truman's watch, local government in Jackson County became more efficient. It wasted less money. Truman himself was scrupulously honest, just as Pendergast had hoped. In fact, Truman was such a good little cog in the Pendergast machine that, come 1934, Pendergast was ready to promote him. He asked the former farmer how he'd feel about becoming a senator. Just like that, Harry Truman found himself on his way to Congress.
Oh, indestructible shoes.
They are a nice looking shoe.
First thing I found really...
I'm going to try to be quiet and just...
When Truman arrived in Washington on the 31st of December 1934, his past did not go unnoticed. Pendergast's goons had stuffed ballot boxes to get Truman through his Senate primary, and it was widely thought the new senator was just a puppet of the Kansas City boss. Indeed, Truman's nickname on Capitol Hill was the senator from Pendergast. But Truman refused to take the bait. He carried on as he had in Jackson County, diligently and with great personal integrity. Had this Pendergast connection not been widely known, it's unlikely that anyone on Capitol Hill would have ever linked the two. This soon turned out to be extremely fortunate. In 1939, just as Truman's first term was ending, the federal government came rolling in to Kansas City. Tom Pendergast was arrested and jailed, and his political machine was destroyed. This left Truman in a precarious position. He'd only won his Senate seat thanks to Pendergast. Did he have the political skills to win a second term by himself? Well, as it turns out, he nearly didn't. In the bruising 1940 primary, Truman squeaked the Democratic nomination for his seat by a mere 8,000 votes. This meant relying heavily on urban areas, including urban areas with large African American populations. From 1940 on, Truman would have a lasting reputation as a big city liberal. Still, Truman was returned to Washington, and this time he was determined to make his mark. Truman's first term had been marked by muted support of whatever was popular in Missouri, like FDR's New Deal or bills backing American isolationism. His second term, though, saw Truman suddenly become a vocal champion of rearmament. It's like Truman knew America was already destined to enter the war in Europe, and he was going to use it to his advantage. In March 1941, Truman approached Franklin Roosevelt, just then embarking on his record-breaking third term. Truman told the president that he was worried about the military wasting money and recommended setting up a panel to investigate spending. FDR basically shrugged and said, "Sure, why not?" That inauspicious start was how the Truman Committee was born. Running from 1941 to 1944, the Truman Committee became famous across America. Like a superhero accountant whose superpower is being really, really good at accounting, Truman combed through every expense, noting every penny. Over 3 years, he saved the government billions of dollars. This had the not-so-subtle side effect of separating him from his Pendergast past. Once the US entered the war in 1941, Truman's pen-pushing came to be seen as patriotism, ensuring money that would have been wasted went towards fighting Hitler. The upshot was that Truman reached 1944 no longer known as the senator from Pendergast, but as a respected centrist Democrat. This was unbelievably good timing. In 1944, the Democrats were trying to decide their ticket for the upcoming presidential election. While there was no doubt FDR would be the headline act, his current VP, a guy called Henry A. Wallace, was considered too left-wing to be allowed to run again. So party bosses essentially went to FBR and said, "Look, we're going to replace Wallace. Deal with it." To which we love to imagine FDR would say something like, "Sure, whatever, get out of my office, I have a war to win." In that moment, the fates of these two men were sealed. Henry Wallace was destined to be pushed out of the corridors of power, and Truman was suddenly destined to become president. Now, you might not be running for office, but if you were, you'd need a website, and I'd recommend building that website with Squarespace. How's that for a transition? So look, a couple of things. Maybe you've got an idea for some sort of business. Bosses descended on Chicago, Henry A. Wallace got wind of his replacement, and he began kicking up a huge stink. Truman, on the other hand, discovered that he was in the running to be VP and did everything in his power to wiggle out of it. But there was nothing he could do to stop his star from rising. At the convention, the anti-Wallace faction was strong enough to bring the VP down, but it was too weak to get their own one elected. So everyone settled on Truman as the compromise candidate. And finally, after 2 bruising days, the man from Missouri wound up on the ticket. Absolutely no one was happy with this. Truman didn't want to be Veep. FDR didn't want him to be Veep. And everyone at the convention had somebody else that they would rather see as the Veep. Yet it didn't matter. Come November, FDR's wartime record saw him handily beat Republican candidate Thomas Dewey, and suddenly Truman was the vice president. It was a role that he would hold for barely 80 days. On the afternoon of April the 12th, 1945, Harry Truman was summoned to the White House. It was a curious order to receive. In his entire time as VP, Truman had barely seen FDR, barely been let in on plans for his 4th term. As Truman arrived at the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt came out to meet him. "Harry," she said, "the president is dead." Truman later said he felt as if the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. He collapsed into a big leather chair in the cabinet room, waiting for the Chief Justice to come and swear him in as president. As others arrived at the White House, the enormity of it all sank in. America was at war. Although that war was in its endgame, the political giant who'd guided the nation through its darkest hours was gone. In his place was a small-town man who, were it not for a quirk of fate, would right now be managing a men's clothing store in Missouri. One cabinet member later recalled looking at Truman and thinking, "He looks like such a little man." he didn't mean in literal terms. At the press conference announcing Truman's ascension to the presidency, people were shocked. One BBC journalist later recalled reporters saying, "My God, what have we been landed with?" You could tell Truman was thinking along similar lines. That day, April the 12th, Truman became the 33rd President of the United States. Almost immediately, he was thrown in at the deep end. Truman's first months in office were the kind prospective presidents have nightmares about. Barely had his first press conference ended than he was having to sign off on arrangements for the first ever UN meeting in San Francisco. Only weeks after that, he was desperately helping to arrange Germany's unconditional surrender. It was a whirlwind of work overseeing the end of a war that had raged on for years. It was also about to get so much harder. Although Germany's surrender had ended the war in Europe, the war in the Pacific was still raging. It wouldn't be long before the new president was called upon to make the most controversial decision any president will ever make.
What do you want?
Want a job that I don't hate. Want to do something that matters.
When Eleanor Roosevelt, when she told him, the president's dead, I think Truman said something like, "Oh my gosh, what can I do for you?" And she said something to the effect of, "Harry, you're the president now. What can we do for you?" And it was like this moment of, oh yeah. Huh. All she has to do now is plan a funeral. You gotta figure everything else out. And that was just kind of a whoa moment for him. Oh, whoa!
For as long as people talk about Harry Truman, they'll talk about his decision to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Was it a war crime? Was it an atrocity? Or was it a proportionate response to a racist, militaristic nation that was refusing to surrender? Whichever side you're on, the basic facts are there. Faced with estimates of up to 500,000 dead in an invasion of Japan, Truman authorized nuclear strikes. On August the 6th, the Little Boy bomb dropped.
I'm all over the place on this one. I understand why it was dropped. I also think that maybe it shouldn't have been. Yeah. If I'm in that situation, would I have dropped 2 bombs thinking I could have sped up the end of the war? Probably. If I was told, this is going to be a bomb that if other countries get their hands on, it could be, something that maybe you don't want the world to know exists. Yeah, maybe I don't drop it.
On Hiroshima, ending 80,000 lives. The next day, Truman went on TV and declared that if the Japanese do not now accept our terms of surrender, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. 2 days later, the Fat Man bomb landed on Nagasaki, killing 40,000. On August the 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. World War II was over. But while one war was winding down, another was lumbering into view. The following spring, 1946, Truman joined Britain's wartime leader, Winston Churchill, on stage in Missouri. There, the former Prime Minister gave a speech in which he warned of an Iron Curtain descending across the continent of Europe. Today, the Iron Curtain speech is seen as the opening salvo in the Cold War. Not only did it galvanize Western opinion to the USSR, it also pushed Truman to make his own major speech. On March the 12th, 1947, Truman stood before Congress and declared, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way." It was the beginning of the Truman Doctrine, the American policy of containing Soviet expansion, and it would set the tone for the entire 20th century. One positive side effect came just a year later. Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed a plan to rescue Europe's shattered economies, and Truman embraced it as a way to stop the communist advance from spreading westward. Signed into law on April 3rd, 1948, the Marshall Plan would totally rebuild Europe. But the Soviets were all too aware of its secondary anti-communist aim, and they weren't going to leave such a provocation unanswered. On June 24th, 1948, the USSR suddenly blockaded all roads and rail lines into West Berlin. At the time, some 2 million people lived there in islands of Allied rule amid an ocean of Soviet administration. In Washington, the hawks in Truman's cabinet urged the president to declare war to take the fight to the Soviets. But for someone who would garner a reputation as a warmonger, Truman was remarkably restrained. He ordered supplies to be flown into West Berlin for as long as the blockade remained. Known as the Berlin Airlift, the operation would become one of the biggest logistical feats of the 20th century. At its height, one plane was landing in or taking off from West Berlin every 30 seconds, bringing clothing, food, water, medicine, and basic supplies for an entire city. It was a grand achievement, all the more so for not spiraling into World War III. By the time the Soviets lifted the blockade in the spring of 1949, there was no longer any doubting what was happening. Any lingering hopes of rapprochement with the communists was over. The Cold War was officially on.
Yeah.
The Groove Wallet's so cool, it'll get you out of some tough situations.
Shut up. Yeah, Truman. I just forgot what I was gonna say about him. Oh yeah, the landing the planes to supply, having one land every 30 seconds, just for what, a year? I mean, just the strategy in that. That's amazing. That's a feat. I hit the button.
By rights, Truman should have ended his first term riding high. He'd overseen the end of World War II, helped rebuild Europe, overcome the Berlin blockade, issued an executive order desegregating the military, and made the US the first nation on Earth to recognize Israel. But rather than a winner, Truman marched towards his first election a badly damaged loser. In 1946, the midterms had resulted in a Republican wave sweeping Congress. As the 1948 election approached, the Democrats' liberal wing had jumped ship to campaign for Henry A. Wallace's Progressive Party. Upstairs, the party bigwigs had begged Dwight D. Eisenhower to replace Truman as the Democratic candidate. Finally, the Southern Democrats also abandoned the party to vote for Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrats. As November 1948 approached, a victory for Republican Thomas E. Dewey seemed certain. Never mind that Truman spent the fall doggedly riding trains from town to town across the nation, making fiery speeches decrying the do-nothing, good-for-nothing Republican Congress. Never mind the vast crowds that turned up to Truman's whistle-stop tours, chanting, "Give 'em hell, Harry." None of it mattered. The polls all said that Truman was toast. As the Chicago Tribune prepared its presses, the editors were so sure of a Dewey landslide that they printed the front pages reading, "Dewey defeats Truman." We can only hope that there was plenty of humble pie to go around that newsroom. On November 3rd, 1948, America woke to the news that Harry Truman had won a second term. Not only that, he'd trounced Dewey. The Dixiecrats had collapsed. The Progressive Party was nowhere to be seen. When Truman picked up a copy of the Chicago Tribune and waved it at reporters, a vast grin on his face, an iconic moment in politics was made.
I don't know if he's going to say this, but after Truman won, the Truman Presidential Organization sent out postcards, and they sent it out to donors and stuff like that. And they were invited to show up at the White House for Truman's not re-inaugural, for the speech. You know, he won, and so that, you know, they want you to be there and celebrate with him. Well, the Harry Truman Foundation or whatever, the presidential thing, they sent one to Harry Truman himself. And I guess he responded back something to the effect of, they were like, will you be there with Harry Truman on his, on the day? And he wrote back to him on the postcard, if weather's permitting, I'll be there. Like, that's just hilarious. And then he sent it in the mail to him. How great was that?
In January, Truman returned to the White House following the first televised inauguration in history. Immediately, he got to work transforming the country, or rather, he tried to get to work. Despite pulling off the political upset of the century, Truman found his hands tied in his second term by a Democratic Congress that hated his guts. When he tried to pass his Fair Deal legislation, which would have brought in swaths of new social programs benefiting African Americans, it got so watered down that there was almost nothing left. But Truman's second term was never fated to be remembered for its domestic agenda. Instead, it would be events on a peninsula 11,000 kilometers away that decided how history saw Harry Truman. On June the 25th, 1950, North Korean troops poured over the 38th parallel, invading South Korea. It was the beginning of the Korean War, a war that would kill millions and leave scars that remain to this day. It would also be the war that ended Harry Truman's career. Few wars have ever been as costly and as pointless as Korea. World War I may have been a freak accident that blew up in everyone's faces, but at least it had an outcome: the collapse of the old European order. Korea, by contrast, started with a communist-backed state and an American-backed state facing each other across the 38th parallel. And it ended with a communist-backed state and an American-backed state facing each other across the 38th parallel. The worst part was the chaos that it took to get to the stalemate. At first, the North overran the South, leaving swaths of destruction in its wake. Then Truman dispatched General Douglas MacArthur to Korea, and the US UN force chased the North back over the 38th parallel and laid waste to their country. But then the Chinese got involved on North Korea's side and forced the Americans all the way back to where they'd started. Cities were burned, massacres were committed, and towns were bombed to oblivion. But for Harry Truman's legacy, only one thing ultimately mattered: the conduct of Douglas MacArthur. Although Truman had been the one to send MacArthur to Korea without waiting for congressional approval, the general soon proved himself to be a loose cannon. In early 1951, he started demanding that America invade China, which would have sparked a full war across the Pacific. With World War II only just over, Truman refused. They weren't going to go down the road of endless devastation. For MacArthur, this was a chump decision, and he said so, loudly. So, Truman fired his ass. And, that was about it for Harry Truman. When he returned from Korea, MacArthur was greeted as a hero. Truman, by contrast, saw his polls tank. His favorability ratings dropped to 22%, lower than any other post-World War II president. Even Nixon, at the height of Watergate, didn't fall that low. Faced with numbers like that, Truman knew that he had no choice but to prepare for his retirement. Although the 22nd Amendment had now been passed limiting the president to 2 terms, an exception had been made for Truman as the sitting president. In another context, Truman might have gone for a 3rd term. He might have tried to match FDR. But with the public against him, what was the point? Truman bowed out of the Democratic primary in March 1952. That November, Eisenhower led the Republicans to a landslide victory, even carrying some southern states. When Truman left the White House in January, the country was glad to see him go. Only, that wasn't quite the end of the story. After his 2nd term, Truman retreated back to Independence, Missouri, and set about tending to his legacy. He'd always said he'd done his damnedest, even when he was unpopular. And over time, people came to believe him. Maybe it was the legacy of his Fair Deal, which wound up being enacted in another form by Lyndon B. Johnson. Maybe it was the memory of the man who'd ended World War II, or his undoubted touch with the common people, or his commitment to civil rights, even in the face of his party's southern wing. Whatever the reason, Truman lived long enough to see his legacy rehabilitated, and it was all he could have asked for. On Christmas Day 1972, Harry Truman slipped into a coma, and he died the next day at the age of 88. Today, Truman consistently ranks as one of the best presidents in US history, in the same league as Teddy Roosevelt or FDR. For a man once seemingly destined to small-town obscurity, this is remarkable. Not even Truman thought he had what it took to lead a nation, and yet when the time came, he stepped up and he proved the world wrong. All too often, making videos about the lives of great people involves talking about brain boxes, or the privileged, or people...
I guess he's gonna end that here. Yeah. Truman had an office. I don't know why I'm going to click on it, but he had an office. But you can, so the books over here were, alrighty, let's try that again. The books on this side were presidential biographies, autobiographies, stuff like it was all presidential. And then the books on the other side were his favorite books. And this is, you really, I apologize, but yeah, you just can't get a good glimpse. But you know, he sat down here right there. Office was packed with stuff. But yeah, he had his office right off of the courtyard where he's buried. And he made a comment that if he ever gets bored after he's dead, he's not too far away from his office, he'll just get up and go back to work. And his wife said something to the effect of, death is retirement, so you ought not. But I recommend, if that's what you're into, you know, go there. And if you do go there, get something from the gift shop, because the money goes to helping keep that stuff open and preserved for all of us. Even non-Americans, you know, you can still go there and look at it. So I'm going to end this here. I'm going to do other presidential videos as well. But I ain't doing them tonight. So, have a good day, have a good night.